Recording in progress.
Oke, baik. Baik, Mas Adit. Terima kasih. Oke, selamat siang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Halo, suara saya sudah terdengar?
Ya, sudah.
Ya, selamat siang. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Selamat datang kepada seluruh partisipan yang sudah hadir pada acara kuliah umum siang hari ini dengan judul Kepemimpinan Perempuan dan Pemilu Inklusif International Lesson Sharing. Hari ini berbahagia sekali kita sudah kedatangan salah satu speaker gitu ya yang sangat expert di bidangnya, Regina Wolf, Senior Global Gender Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral System atau IFES. Selamat siang. Halo, Regina. How are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here. I look forward to today's discussion.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. Oke, selanjutnya kita akan langsung masuk saja kepada sambutan dari Direktur Pusat Kajian Politik Universitas Indonesia kepada Dr. Phil Aditya Perdana. Kami persilahkan.
Oke, terima kasih Mbak Delia sebagai MC. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Pertama-tama saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih atas kehadiran Ibu dan Bapak sekalian di dalam forum diskusi kita hari ini. Kuliah umum kami menyebutnya. Di sini kita masih menunggu teman-teman yang lain yang hadir, mudah-mudahan nanti akan semakin banyak. Yang kedua, saya sebagai pimpinan Pusat Kajian Politik mengucapkan terima kasih banyak kepada IFES Indonesia yang sudah berkenan untuk menghadirkan Ibu Regina Wolf sebagai Senior Global Advisor di IFES. Mudah-mudahan ini sebagai sebuah forum yang menarik gitu ya untuk kita semua nanti bisa belajar dan saling sharing pengalaman terkait dengan kepemimpinan perempuan dan isu pemilu inklusif. Ibu Regina, mungkin saya ingin bisa bercerita sedikit ya dengan apa yang sudah dilakukan oleh Puskapol. Dalam sekitar 6 bulan, 7 bulan belakangan ini, kami memang sedang melakukan kerjasama dengan IFES Indonesia untuk melakukan satu kerjasama dalam konteks SILIDS Indonesia yang memberi kesempatan kepada perempuan-perempuan hebat gitu ya di Indonesia untuk bersama-sama mengikuti satu proses seleksi dalam penyelenggara pemilu yang baru saja sudah usai di tingkat nasional. Jadi saya ingin menyampaikan bahwa ini sebagai sebuah bentuk kolaborasi yang bagi saya luar biasa gitu ya, karena kami melibatkan sekitar 150 orang peserta, Ibu Regina, dari seluruh Indonesia yang sebagian besar adalah penyelenggara pemilu dan mereka sudah memiliki pengalaman kepemimpinan di tingkat daerah dan terbukti cakap gitu ya dalam melakukan kerja-kerja mereka sebagai penyelenggara pemilu. Dan sampai di akhir proses seleksi, 2 alumni kami, satu di KPU dan satu di Bawaslu, telah terpilih dan mudah-mudahan akan dilantik dalam waktu dekat pada tanggal 11 April yang akan datang. Ini adalah sebuah capaian yang menurut pandangan saya sebenarnya relatif sama Bu Regina dengan 5 tahun yang lalu, karena program SILIDS juga endingnya akhirnya di dalam proses seleksi juga sama, yaitu hanya satu orang perempuan di KPU dan satu orang Bawaslu. Satu buah refleksi dari kami adalah memang tidak mudah gitu ya untuk mendorong jumlah perempuan yang lebih banyak gitu sebagai penyelenggara pemilu di tingkat nasional, meskipun kami sudah punya komitmen untuk mengikuti afirmasi sebanyak 30%, tetapi itu tidak mudah. Jadi mungkin nanti kami ingin mendengar pandangan Bu Regina gitu ya, bagaimana pengalaman di negara lain atau pengalaman IFES dalam mendampingi teman-teman perempuan gitu di dalam isu kepemiluan. Bagaimana kita bisa saling belajar soal itu, karena memang kami menyadari ini proses perjuangan yang tidak mudah untuk bisa mencapai titik di mana afirmasi itu bisa dipenuhi dengan baik. Sebagai informasi Ibu Regina, di sini sebagian teman-teman ini adalah para penyelenggara pemilu dan juga alumni dari SILID Indonesia. Jadi mereka inilah yang sebagian memang menjadi bagian dari aktivitas kami selama beberapa bulan yang lalu. Kiranya nanti Bu Regina bisa menyapa teman-teman yang alumni ini juga gitu ya, agar bisa memberikan semangat agar nanti mereka juga terus bisa aktif dalam kepemimpinan perempuan yang akan datang. Kami memang masih punya banyak agenda, Bu Regina dan teman-teman yang lain. Salah satu agenda yang juga tidak kalah penting adalah setelah penyelenggara pemilu yang baru terbentuk, nanti akan ada juga penyelenggara pemilu di tingkat provinsi dan kabupaten kota, dan teman-teman alumni inilah yang kemudian kami harapkan untuk mengisi lebih banyak lagi di tingkat provinsi dan kabupaten kota. Dan selain itu tentu kami juga punya harapan bukan hanya di penyelenggara pemilu, kerjasama kami bisa dilakukan, mudah-mudahan nanti IFES juga bisa memberi ruang dan kesempatan untuk peningkatan perempuan di tempat lain, di ranah lain seperti partai politik, di masyarakat sipil dan sebagainya. Demikian sedikit hal yang bisa saya sampaikan. Saya kembalikan kepada Mbak Delia. Terima kasih Ibu Bapak sekalian. Selamat menikmati dan berdiskusi dengan Ibu Regina. Mudah-mudahan kita bisa belajar banyak, dan juga Bu Regina tentu juga berharap bahwa bisa mendapatkan sharing informasi yang juga bermanfaat buat kita semua. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang.
Ya, Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih Bapak Dr. Pil Aditya Perdana atas sambutannya. Selanjutnya, sebelum kita masuk kepada kuliah umum yang akan diberikan oleh Ibu Regina, sebagai informasi saya ingin menyampaikan bahwa kuliah umum pada siang hari ini dilakukan oleh Puskapol bekerja sama dengan IFES Indonesia dan didukung oleh Australian Government. Baik, sebagai informasi juga kepada Bapak Ibu semuanya, di dalam Zoom ini sudah ada interpretasi. Jadi kalau misalnya Bapak Ibu ingin mendengarkan dalam bahasa Indonesia ataupun dalam bahasa Inggris, Bapak Ibu bisa mengklik interpretation di bawah tampilan Zoom-nya. Apabila ada hambatan, Bapak Ibu bisa sampaikan kepada host. Seperti itu. Baik, selanjutnya kita akan langsung saja masuk ke dalam sesi utama kita, yaitu kuliah umum yang akan disampaikan oleh Ibu Regina berkaitan dengan kepemimpinan perempuan dan pemilu inklusif, International Lesson Sharing. Untuk kuliah umum ini akan dimoderatori oleh Bapak Harlitus Berniawan Telaum Banua. Kepada Bapak Beni, kami memanggilnya, kami persilahkan dan kami serahkan. Silakan.
Baik, terima kasih Delia. Saya merasa mengalami kendala jaringan. Apakah video dan suara saya terdengar jelas?
Sudah.
Ya, terdengar.
Jelas ya. Oke, baik. Terima kasih. Selamat siang, Bapak Ibu sekalian, baik dari Puskapol UI, tim IFES, dan seluruh hadirin yang telah bergabung bersama kita di acara kuliah umum pada siang hari ini dengan tema Kepemimpinan Perempuan dan Pemilu Inklusif, International Lesson Sharing. Sungguh berbahagia kita bisa bersama-sama berkumpul pada agenda siang hari ini. Sebagaimana tadi baik MC maupun dalam pembukaan Mas Adit telah sampaikan bahwa ini merupakan bagian dari rangkaian panjang upaya advokasi yang kita kerjakan di dalam isu spesifik mengenai keterwakilan perempuan. Program SILID telah selesai, lepas dari capaian yang mungkin di dalam standar kita belum memenuhi apa yang menjadi tuntutan regulasi 30%, tetapi ada satu hal yang menjadi sisi positif dari semua proses ini. Ada banyak pembelajaran, ya, ada banyak isu-isu yang berhasil kita identifikasi dan kita angkat, dan terlebih lagi dari program SILID ada banyak masukan-masukan yang boleh menjadi satu wacana ataupun ide yang kita bisa kembangkan di masa depannya, yang bisa kita kita lanjutkan lagi apa yang masih perlu diperbaiki dan apa yang masih dipertahankan. Sebagaimana tadi Direktur Puskapol sudah singgung bahwa ke depan kita akan menghadapi seleksi penyelenggara pemilu di tingkat lokal, ya, di provinsi dan kabupaten kota. Dan ini menjadi tantangan tersendiri. Kenapa? Jika kita melihat dari data yang pernah disampaikan baik di dalam pelatihan SILID maupun di data-data yang kita bisa lihat di berbagai media, masih banyak ataupun ada daerah yang tidak memiliki satu perempuan pun di dalam struktur penyelenggara pemilu, entah itu di KPU maupun itu Bawaslu. Dan jika kita ratakan secara nasional, kita akumulasikan dari keseluruhan, jumlah penyelenggara perempuan jika digabung di tingkat provinsi dan kabupaten kota itu berkisar hanya sekitar 26-27%. Dan tentu saja jika kita mengingat klausul bahwa half of our voters, ya, setengah dari pemilih kita adalah perempuan, itu tidak terjawab secara representatif dengan jumlah perempuan yang juga maksimal di dalam struktur penyelenggara pemilu. Kita sudah banyak membahas, ya, di dalam diskusi publik, seri diskusi publik yang sudah Puskapol lakukan dengan berbagai narasumber, kita sudah identifikasi banyak permasalahan, kita sudah melihat mendengar berbagai masukan-masukan. Nah, kali ini kita akan mencoba, ya, melihat perspektif global, melihat perspektif internasional. Karena tentunya selain mengidentifikasi masalah-masalah yang ada ataupun mencari peluang-peluang strategi memperbaiki hal tersebut, kita juga perlu melakukan komparasi-komparasi dengan melihat pengalaman-pengalaman dari negara-negara lain, praktik-praktik dari negara-negara lain. Dan untuk mendapatkan gambaran, informasi, dan pengetahuan mengenai hal ini, di tengah-tengah kita sudah ada narasumber yang saya yakin sangat kompeten di dalam isu ini, Miss Regina Vo. I hope I pronounce it well. Miss Regina Vo pada siang hari ini akan menyampaikan di dalam 30 menit ke depan akan menyampaikan beberapa sharing, ya, di dalam pengalaman ataupun riset-riset yang dikerjakan oleh IFES. Namun sebelum Regina menyampaikan paparannya, saya akan bacakan terlebih dahulu biodata singkat dari Miss Regina. Yeah. Regina Vo serves as the International Foundation for Electoral Systems Senior Global Gender Advisor. In that role, she provides strategic vision and leadership for IFES gender portfolio in outreach and partnership, technical advancement and innovation, technical assistance, quality assurance, business development, and program design. Ms. Vo came to IFES from more than a decade working for the federal and local governments to promote human rights, gender equality, and women's empowerment. Ms. Vo began her career with the federal government as a presidential management fellow in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State, and went on to serve as the Obama administration director for human rights and gender at the White House National Security Council, and as the chief of staff in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the U.S. Department of State. She also served as the inaugural executive director of the Los Angeles County Women and Girls Initiative. Ms. Vo holds a BA, MPP, and JD, all from the University of California, Berkeley, and is a member of the California Bar. Itu tadi biodata singkat dari Miss Regina. Selanjutnya, tanpa berlama-lama, without further ado, to Miss Regina, the room, the virtual room, and Sam is yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here and very honored to have such a kind and warm welcome. It's my sincere pleasure to get to chat with you all today. I do have a slide presentation prepared. I'm happy to share my screen and run the slides myself. I'm not sure if somebody else might be able to do that. But why don't I just go ahead and just give me one moment. I believe I have host privileges. And I will go ahead and put that up, and then we can all look at the same thing, and we don't all have to look at my face in my hotel room for 30 minutes while I'm talking. So I'm going to turn my video off just because I will get a bit distracted otherwise. But I believe we will have time for questions and discussion after the presentation. So I will encourage you to please do be ready to share and have a chat once this is going. I'm going to start with a short video, and I hope this is not too much trouble for our interpreters. It's very short though, so it shouldn't. Even if it is, it's only less than a minute. I know that we all know about all of the benefits that women bring to having equal participation in all manner of life, right? But especially we're here today to talk about women's participation in the electoral space and women's leadership as political leaders, as gatekeepers and safeguarders of rights for everyone. So I wanted to go ahead and just start with a short video that IFES produced a bit ago that I think really encapsulates why we need to care about gender equality in elections. So I'm going to press play on this, and hopefully that will start shortly and everyone will be able to see. Okay, so hopefully, oh no, hopefully everybody was able to see that and understand it for the most part. So because my topic today is talking about inclusive elections and women's leadership, I wanted to just get us on the same page in terms of definition. So this is in very basic terms, right? What would constitute an inclusive election? An inclusive election is really one where everybody who is eligible has the opportunity to vote to choose their elected representatives. That is at the most basic level what we're talking about here. And that of course includes an equal opportunity to access the polls as voters. So making sure that everybody who is eligible, by virtue of age, et cetera, is able to vote and able to vote freely, right? So that they are making their own choice as a candidate, and ideally an informed choice for who they would like to be their preferred candidate. That everybody has the equal opportunity to contest for office, right? To run for office, and then of course an equal opportunity to serve as an election administrator. And that doesn't mean that everybody will, but that they have an equal opportunity to do so. So that's quite basic. I should say first principles there. So when we're talking about gender inclusive elections, I think just breaking down these three areas that I had already mentioned. So obviously talking about women as voters, then I'll talk a little bit about women as candidates, and then about the gender balance of women as election officials. So women who are members of EMBs and otherwise involved in election administration, which I know is of particular interest to all of you. So let's start very quickly with a quick overview of women as voters. So we see here a young woman casting her ballot I think what's interesting is if you look at the global data, right, on women voting and exercising their right to vote, if you look at it globally, there is pretty much gender parity, right? So around the world, women vote at about the same rates as men. But when you start to divide that up by gender, or excuse me, by country, when you look more at the country level data, there actually are pretty significant differences in whether men vote more than women, and vice versa. So in the United States, for example, for the last probably 50 or 60 years, women have voted with greater consistency and in greater numbers than men in basically every national election. And of course, that's not true in every country. I think I was looking at some data from the World Value Survey, which was pulling together data from, I think they asked people in 58 countries about whether or not whether they voted, whether they always voted in national elections. And in 23 of those countries, women reported voting more than men did. Women were more likely to choose always. They always voted in their national election. Whereas in 35 countries, men were more likely than women to say that they always voted. And so, at that point, you're seeing a pretty significant gender gap, but you can understand why it's canceling itself out when you're considering those countries globally. So there's a lot of nuance in the individual country circumstance, and that's important to keep in mind, because I think that video shows we want to make sure that every person who has the right to vote is voting, and it's important to be able to dive into the data a little bit to understand better, who's voting in what country and why. What I thought was very interesting, and I am not an expert on kind of voting statistics, but when I was looking at this was all self-reported survey data, right? And one of the things that the authors of this particular report that I was looking at mentioned was that almost no countries report official data from election administrators from their election administration process about the gender breakdown of voters. And that's in large part because with the secrecy of the ballot, right, we can know the gender of people registered to vote, right, people who are eligible to vote in a particular country. But generally, most EMBs around the world do not gender disaggregate their, collect gender data and then disaggregate it and make it available for researchers in terms of the gender balance of their voters. So I think for many people in the field, it would be very valuable if EMBs and election officials were able to do that and to be able to make that data, at least in the aggregate, known, because it would help us feel better, I think, about the quality of the data that we were dealing with. There are a handful of countries that do this successfully, so we know it is possible. I think Australia is one, I believe Costa Rica, and I think India were three of the examples that I've seen. But often it's just a matter of kind of time and expense and capacity that keep countries from doing that. So that's where we are on the voting side. There is roughly gender parity in votes in the number of people that cast a ballot in an election, but the nuance is very different from country to country and likely from community to community. So when we're talking about the next kind of thing on our list was women as candidates, and I want to talk a little bit about why women may or may not decide to contest for election at the same levels as men, right? And in a number of countries around the world, there are gender quotas in place, right? So that helps kind of address both the supply side of whether women are interested in running for office, feel supported in running for office, and whether or not the political parties that are often the ones that control whether or not they end up on a ballot are interested in having them run for office, right? So both that supply side, are there enough women candidates that are interested and kind of ready to run for office? And then also the demand side, are there political parties ready to put them on the ballot? So quotas very often, because they tend to operate, a lot of them operate at the political party level, including in Indonesia and many other countries, that kind of addresses both, in some cases, both the supply side and the demand side. You would expect that at least 30%, right, of your candidates for elected office in a place with a 30% quota are women. But in places like the United States, where there is no quota system, where we have generally quite low levels of representation of women, because there's no guarantee that you will end up accepted as a candidate for office and make it onto a ballot if you're planning to contest for election. So I wanted to share this example with you all because I think right now at the national level, our Congress is across both chambers. We have the Senate, which is the higher chamber, and the House of Representatives, which is the lower chamber of Congress. I think we're at something like 27.5%. So not great. And, one of the things that has been studied a lot is women not being interested or willing to put themselves up as candidates. And that's what I'm talking about here when I have this mention of the ambition gap. The Brookings Institution has done this study over the last 20 years at least. So the first year they did it was in 2000, and the most recent data I think is from 2021, so quite current. And a couple of things I just want to flag besides what's on the screen, which I find to be fascinating. One is that the gap hasn't changed, right? So women have not become any more willing relative to their male counterparts to run for office, and that continues to be the case, even though in the US, more women actually have made it to the highest levels of leadership, right? We have a female vice president now. We had Hillary Clinton as the first major political party candidate for president, which was a very significant step. Nancy Pelosi, who is the first woman speaker of the House of Representatives, was first elected to that position, I believe, in 2008. So over the last 20 years, there have been additional role models for US women to look up to. But in fact, that has not really done much of anything to close the gender gap between men and women in terms of their interest in running for office, which is what the Brookings Institution calls the ambition gap. And I just thought I lifted a couple of statistics from this article because I think they're really interesting. So in the United States, nearly 60% of men have considered running for office, while nearly 60% of women have not, right? When somebody asks you if you've ever considered running for office, 60% of men responded by saying yes, compared to presumably 40% of women. They surveyed men and women with the same credentials, so people who arguably on paper have exactly the same level of qualification, whether it's education, professional background, et cetera. 36% of men surveyed consider themselves very qualified to run for office, compared to 20% of women. And of course, these are people who are exactly the same level of qualification. And then on the flip side of that, women were 3 times as likely as men, again similarly situated, to rate themselves as not at all qualified. And then I think the third point is also very important, because it's less about self-perception, I think, than about the ways in which men get messages that are different than women about whether they should run for office, right? So men are 2/3 more likely than women to have been encouraged to run for office by an elected official or a party leader or a political activist. So somebody with a lot of credibility and presumably an ability to make that happen, right? And 40% more likely to receive that suggestion to run from a colleague or a spouse or a family member. So someone they know personally, who knows them well, presumably wants the best for them. Men are much more likely to be told by either people they know or people that are in a good position to have credibility in the field that they should run for office. So I think that's very telling about why we don't have as many women, not just being elected as leaders, but also contesting as candidates. And then relevant to this group, I am sure, and I certainly hope, I'm once again borrowing a whole slide from the organization International IDEA, which does really good work around the world. And this is very, very new data, but I suspect will be particularly relevant for this group, which is that as of March 2020, so this month, they looked at the gender of EMB chairs all around the world. And it turns out that only 22% of those chairs, the highest kind of position in EMB, are women. So there's a lot of work to do all around the world. And I would note this proportion of EMB chairs in Asia, in the Asia region, only 10% are women. So, and I think that is in fact the lowest level across the board, and that's 208 countries and territories. So it's a very comprehensive overview of all of the EMB chairs. So women are underrepresented kind of across the board, and as a result, if you don't have necessarily equal proportion of women voting in particular countries, you definitely don't have equal numbers of women contesting as candidates. You don't have equal numbers of women serving in leadership roles at EMBs. And often I suspect, and I don't have these stats off the top of my head, I suspect women generally across the board are not serving in equal proportion across the election management systems. It's not at all surprising to me that women are also falling behind, or have been behind for a long time in leadership in the political arena. So I suspect many of you are familiar with these stats, but I think they're worth repeating. I will also note that this is from 2021 statistics, and this document, the Global Gender Gap Report from the World Economic Forum, comes out right around this time every year. So it is entirely possible that we will have new numbers literally tomorrow that would give us numbers from 2021 or from 2020, the 2022 gaps. So, there was bad news in 2021, largely reflecting the 2020 numbers, wherein we saw that not only are women just kind of only serving as 26% of parliamentarians and only 21% of government ministers, only 26 women serving as heads of state, just period, which is not great. The global gender gap in political empowerment in particular, which is the largest of the four gaps that this particular report measures. The others relate to economic empowerment. One is about educational attainment, and then the fourth is about health and I think like lifespan. And it's worth noting that both the education gap and the health and lifespan gap have essentially closed globally. There are definitely some differences, again, country by country, but the global gender gap in those two areas has closed, which means that the political empowerment gap only being closed by 22% to date, right, is not to do with women's lack of education, right, or qualification to be a political leader or a leader in any area. And in fact, very unfortunately, in part because of COVID and just like the devastation that has wrought on on the world, and the fact that women really bore the brunt of a lot of that, the gap actually widened a bit between men and women by 2.4% since 2020. And I have to underscore this point because we can't keep progressing, right? I know I'm preaching to the choir here, as they say in English. We have to make bigger, faster gains in all of these spaces, because if we keep making progress at the rate that we have been making progress, it's going to take us more than 145 years to get to gender parity in politics, by which I mean political leadership that looks like the population, right? Where women are actually represented at the level that they're represented in actual numbers. So how did we get here? It's important to think about this. So what are some of the barriers that women face to participating in elections? And this is barriers kind of across the board. Some of them I think will be quite specific to actually voting, but we have cultural norms. So just general patriarchal systems that are misogynistic or that do not see women as fundamentally equal to men, which means that they are discouraged from participating in the public space. They are sometimes prevented from voting. They are prevented from taking on any kind of role in public and political life. Oftentimes in order to vote, but then of course to do many other things, you need to be able to produce identification, and women are less likely to have ID and to be able to prove, with a birth certificate or prove citizenship or any of the other things that someone might need to be able to run for office. Transportation and mobility concerns, women tend to have greater risks in trying to get to a polling place, whether that is from violence, whether it is not being able to like actually afford to make it on public transportation, not being able to walk there, not having the independence and mobility to move on their own, the lack of resources to get whatever documentation is together, to pay to get to a polling place. If you're interested in running for office, lack of resources is a huge barrier. And of course, security concerns, both with respect to the threats that women get just by walking in the world all day, every day. But also, of course, women are more likely to be, displaced from their place of origin by conflict or any number of other things, in which case going back to where you're from in order to vote, which is a requirement in many places, is a significant barrier. And then lower levels of education, which I think, as I mentioned, globally that gap has closed. But of course, there are some countries in the world where women have much lower levels of literacy than men, and there are still areas that have not achieved parity and even levels of elementary education, which means that it's harder to participate as a member of political society. And then, if we're thinking about what is keeping women from leadership roles, and this is just a very general list, but I think we'll see some of this manifested in the conversation that we'll have after this. Lack of knowledge or awareness or information about how to get involved, right? So for my colleagues who have gone through the She Leads program, and I spoke to a number of women today who have been, BWASLU members at the local level, a couple of them didn't know about BWASLU until somebody mentioned it to them. And then they had a sense of that this was something to apply for, and they were qualified and they were selected. And, there are many women who don't have that knowledge, right? They don't know how to get involved. They don't know that this is for them. So I think that is one hurdle, and one that part of it is, I think, quite easily corrected. And we can talk a little bit shortly about some ideas about how to do that. Of course, there are social and cultural attitudes about traditional gender roles. And depending on where you are in the world, some of those are very, very fixed. Some of them are very, very narrow. And a lot of those attitudes really do hold women back. So even those women who are very keen and very aware and very ready to participate, ready to put themselves out there, they are, stopped by other people in their lives. They're sometimes threatened by people. They may be interested in running for office, but not have the confidence because they don't see anybody else that looks like them running for office or putting themselves forward to serve in some sort of other leadership role. Those women, including EMB leaders, and there's some good documentation of this that do serve as kind of a leading voice in the EMB and in other political and public spaces, are threatened with violence, and women tend to experience gender-based violence both online and off. And both public and private, so sometimes in their homes and by members of their family who are not keen to see them take on a leadership role. They tend to be threatened at much higher rates of intensity and levels, and they are threatened and kind of told not to participate because they shouldn't be participating, right? That the whole reason that they are not meant to. The whole reason people criticize them or threaten them is because they're a woman seeking to serve as a leader or to serve in a public role, versus people are unhappy with their performance, or people don't think that they don't want this candidate to be in this role. They want somebody else. For many women who face this type of criticism, it is because they are women. There tends to be a lack of resources and support for those women who do want to run for office or otherwise serve in leadership roles. And that manifests in a bunch of different ways. So some of it is just lack of support and resources at home. So if you're at home and your family expects you to run the household and take care of the children, and you have all of these responsibilities that are in fact a full-time job all on their own, and then you want to go and seek elected office, you want to go and serve as a BWASLU member at your local or your regional level, or to vie for one of the spots at the national level, if you're also expected to do all the things you were doing before, you are going to be essentially working twice as hard as all of the men who may not be expected to maintain those same roles. Similarly, in political parties in particular, and otherwise, many women do not have the kind of traditional, old boys club network that allows them to bring in voters and to have financial support for their campaigns, to have the political parties themselves put forward support for their campaigns and actually lift them up as good candidates for office. Men are much more likely to have those types of supports as well. And women as a whole have fewer economic resources than men do. And because often contesting for election or running, being able to have, help in your home to help with your domestic responsibilities while you're also serving as a member of an EMB or other form of election official tends to mean that the only people who are able to make both those things happen are people with resources. And that is another form of inequality that we do not want to see perpetuated in our leadership and in our elected officials. And then, in a number of countries, and I think will sound familiar to some of you, there are no gender quotas at all. There are no special measures or affirmative actions, or those things exist, but they are not articulated with the appropriate level of legal force, and they do not, as a result, have the same level of enforceability, right? So it's not clear. It's presented as a suggestion that it would be good if you thought to have 30% of your membership be women. And with that type of, that both sends a message about how committed you are to this making this a reality, but it also means that it's very hard to enforce those quotas in the courts. And there's a lot of different ways that this manifests, not just in the particular case of the Bawaslu here, where we see very qualified women, certainly more than the 20% who have been selected at the highest level of the Bawaslu and the KPU Commission. And then, there are other places where the quota is in place. It is quite clear. People still don't follow it, or they follow it in just the letter of the law and not at all in keeping with the spirit. So women might be on the ballot, but they're never put up in a jurisdiction where they have any chance of winning, right? Where the political party maybe is going to only nominate women candidates in those areas where that party is never going to win, right? And so there are some examples of places that have successfully managed to address that issue, but it takes actual political will and a willingness and creativity and support to make that happen. Okay, so what are we going to do about this? It can be very discouraging, of course, to know that we have women who are so qualified and passionate and ready to serve, that arguably our governments and our world would be a lot better if more women were represented. And yet, despite all of that, we still see these gender gaps that feel very, very hard to close. So let's look at a couple of things. So one, I gave us all kind of a list of all the different ways that this is kind of manifesting, right? So it's happening in kind of every sector of public life and political life and electoral life. But it's also happening because at a bunch of different levels, right? It's happening in the home. It's happening online. It's happening in political parties. It's happening in election management bodies. It's happening amongst the electorate, right? It's happening with local leaders. So our approach to addressing these issues has to also be multifaceted. So one thing is just this acknowledgement, and I've been so pleased to see so many men participating in the various events that I've been involved with this week. But the reality is that gender equality is not just women's, problem to solve, right? Women are underrepresented, but gender equality benefits literally everyone. And so it is, in fact, everybody's responsibility to help us get there. So I just want to state that from the beginning. And then, of course, because change kind of has to happen at all levels, and I would argue all at once, to kind of make everything stick and really be ingrained, I've included a few things here. So legal and regulatory changes in those places that don't have either quotas, affirmative actions, or temporary special measures that might actually help to ensure that women can take on the role that they deserve in their countries and communities. Making sure that that legislative language, or sometimes even constitutional language, is actually enforceable in the form of very clear legislation and or regulations that give clear directives to the responsible entity to implement the law, and then of course that also give CSOs and advocates and courts the ability to bring cases when parties are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and having an enforceable piece of legislation and regulation. I would argue that you have to do those two things, that kind of top-down approach, with the broader cultural change that needs to happen across literally every country in the world, where both men and women have to understand that men and women are fundamentally equal and deserve the same opportunities in life to live out their dreams, regardless of whether or not they are married, regardless of whether or not they have children, regardless of what their particular background might be, right? We all deserve that equal opportunity to do so. And when we put ourselves out there and get training and get ready to take on a new role, we can't be met with violence and harassment, and the type of terrorizing, frankly, that happens to too many women who decide that they want to do this and they want to take on a role in their community. And the only way that we're going to make these changes more structurally and permanently is if we start doing that socializing at the kind of home level, and everybody is on board with this, and at the same time we have laws in place that actually protect the women who are taking the chances to make changes in their communities. And then a lot of that, I would say, is also coupled with this kind of civic and voter education that needs to happen and needs to be done in the right way, right? Because oftentimes civic and voter education tends to be tremendously underfunded. So people don't know about the opportunities that are out there. They don't know why it's important to participate in their government. They don't know why it's important to vote and to register to vote, and to make sure that when you register to vote, you vote based on your own, decision making. You're not being expected to vote because for the person that your husband wants you to vote for, or that your father wants you to vote for, or that you're not to be expected to vote just because somebody offered you money or offered you, coffee or sugar or something that is useful in your house, right? We want people to vote because they're informed about what the candidate is going to be able to do once they're in office, and that they're making a free choice. And civic and voter education is very important about that. And I think also we want that type of voter education to send the right messages, and also to be able to help everybody understand the challenges that women are facing in being equal participants in political leadership roles. And then of course, political will, right? We can have all of this, but if there aren't the people in charge who are willing to make changes, including changes that may result in them having more competition, we're going to be fighting this battle for a lot longer than we should have to. Okay, so if we're looking at, just very quickly, we want to be able to make sure that every woman who is eligible to vote can vote. There are a bunch of different ways that we can reduce some of the barriers to things like, being able to register, right? So some of this is being able to prove, if you have to have an ID, making sure that you are able to easily get the documentation that you need, or that there are alternative ways to verify you are who you are. Photographic identifications can be particularly tricky for people, depending on your religious beliefs, whether or not you feel comfortable removing a face covering to have your picture taken, whether or not you are comfortable showing your picture to somebody that you don't know, all of those kinds of things. And there are different ways that we can make that more possible and accessible for women who tend to encounter these challenges more than men do. So one is, in particularly conservative places, it might be better for women to only be approached to register to vote by women-only registration teams, right? For things like getting your photo taken, maybe you're not comfortable removing your face covering to have your photo taken in public. But if you're able to go into a room with a woman photographer to have it done there, then that's okay. Mobile voter registration is very important because very often it's just women are extremely busy. It can be expensive and dangerous to get from where they live to where they would need to go to vote or to register to vote. And it can be a lot easier if somebody comes to them and comes to their community or their village, and they're able to all kind of get a number of people registered at once. I think I mentioned voter information before, and we'll have a couple of examples about why it's important to have that be targeted to women, and also to be sending the right messages about voter registration and voting just generally to everyone, not just women. And then making sure that those people who are registering voters are also, especially have special training about the particular challenges that women may encounter in trying to register to vote. So this is just a little bit more about voter education outreach, because having the full portion of women who are able to vote helps us kind of achieve all of these other goals with respect to women's representation, which is not to say that women should always be expected to vote for other women just because they're women. But I do think that we want to make sure that women are making informed choices about what their rights are as voters and as citizens, and making sure that they are free to select their candidate for office when they vote. So there are a bunch of different ways that we want to make sure that can happen. So I'm going to show you an example of some work that IFES did in Nepal. At the picture on the left is the original image. So this was a voter education campaign talking about the importance of being able to register to vote and how you go about doing it, right? And it shows people coming to a particular place to register voters. And we noticed IFES was working with the developers of this campaign, and we noticed that the three people doing the most action in this shot are all men. And there are women here, but they're just kind of the bystanders, right? So we recommended, and this change was made, that two of the men engaging in this process be replaced by women, so that women are not just bystanders, women are not just observers, women are actual participants and being shown in participating and leadership and active roles. So that's a very small example. When we're looking at nomination and registration of candidates, of course, that's something that EMBs have a lot of responsibility for, particularly in places where there are quotas. And of course, I recognize that it can be particularly frustrating when EMBs themselves are not necessarily living up to the quota that they've set, right? But EMBs do have a role to play in ensuring that there is compliance with quota laws, right? And that to the extent applicable, there's also campaigns are also complying with relevant campaign finance rules. So as much as there are things that we can't change right off the bat, making sure that when a nomination slate comes through if it doesn't have the requisite number of voters or women on the ballot to fulfill that candidate quota, that EMBs take on their role of rejecting that slate, or working with, or giving the political party the opportunity to cure. That's an incredibly important part of the work that EMBs can do. And then, because women face so much criticism and violence and harassment, particularly online, but just generally, violence against women in politics and violence against women leaders, particularly in the context of elections, which has a really chilling effect, including on members of EMBs who happen to be very prominent in their communities, and then they're raising their voices and making points and trying to educate their communities at times when tensions are often running high, which is during the electoral period. I think EMBs have this particular challenge of kind of being most known and everybody knowing most about what they're doing during the most contentious part of a political season, right? Or a particular series of years, right? And so often a lot of the hate speech that we typically see reserved for women candidates or for women leaders, we will also see develop during political campaigns targeting women who are involved in election administration. So we've helped groups around the world develop a number of public public-facing campaigns to raise awareness about the impact of online hate speech against women candidates and women officials. And this example from Myanmar included a countering disinformation certificate course, so people could learn how to identify disinformation and push back on it. It also just had support and an opportunity for people who had been targeted in this way to get their testimonials out there and to make these kind of more personal pleas. It was a place to come together to provide support to people who had some of these experiences. And there were both online panel discussions and then in-person awareness raising events. And then I think this is the last thing I wanted to talk about before opening the discussion up. And I suspect I've taken longer than the 30 minutes I promised, so I apologize. But one place I did want to highlight that I think is particularly encouraging is Mexico. And Mexico is a country that still has a lot of patriarchal attitudes about women. There's a culture of machismo in Mexico, where there's a lot of value placed on kind of traditional roles for men and women. It's important for men to be seen as macho and tough and as leaders. Women, there are a lot of expectations about how women are expected to behave. There are extremely high rates of gender-based violence in Mexico, including femicide. So I tell you all of this just because despite all of those cultural, this kind of cultural permeating environment for women in Mexico, they have also achieved parity in their in their legislature, right? That I think happened in 2018, but there was also, so they had I think they started out with something like a 40% quota. Women ended up being able to get themselves elected and to take up half the seats in the legislature, and then leveraged that, worked across party lines, built coalitions, and managed to get a constitutional reform on the books in 2019 that basically required parity in everything. So basically saying that there must be gender parity for all candidates for elected office at every level and for top executive and judicial positions across the government. So the June 2021 elections were the first time that this was tested, right? It was the first time since that constitutional reform had happened that we had to see whether or not what was going to happen, if everybody was going to follow the rules. And there was the largest elections in Mexico's history. They had something like 20,000 positions were being elected for. They broke records in terms of women's candidacy. So more than 50% of women were candidates in this election. And it resulted in a tremendous amount of representation and movement in the right direction. So there were 15 governorships, so like state level positions in Mexico that were being contested in that election. 6 of them were won by women. And I mention that because in the whole of Mexico's history, since women got the right to vote in 1953, only 9 women total had been elected as governors, right? And yet in one election, 6 women were elected. So that's some pretty extraordinary progress. And, when we're talking about how that happened, one of the things is that there were these important legislative requirements, right? But Mexico also has, in the form of its election management body, which is the INE, and there's a quote right here that is from one of their INE members that I really like. But also they have an oversight body, the tribunal, which I'm not going to say the name in Spanish because it is long, and I always just call it the tribunal. But that is their court that oversees election related disputes, and that has the opportunity that supervises the results of the INE, and also has the opportunity to make final rulings on all elections related cases. And they've been incredibly progressive and incredibly forward leaning in terms of requiring political parties to do what they're supposed to be doing, right? So these affirmative actions have been put in place by the Mexican legislature. There are these quotas in place, and the INE has been very, very consistent and forward-leaning about ensuring that rules are obeyed, right? And this quote from Georgina de la Fuente basically just says that women are not going to organically just advance themselves, right? We don't live in societies where that happens. Setting up rules is important, and rules can guarantee that women are able to exercise their rights like anyone else. So I think it's a very hopeful case, and argues, provides us with some good guidance for something that feels like that it is concrete and achievable. They've made tremendous progress, but they've made tremendous progress because the political will has been there, and there have been members of these institutions who have been willing to push back against political parties and other entities that might try to get around these quotas and these rules. And once some of this got going, it created a bit of a snowball where women were really able to make some important progress. And women were always qualified, right? Just like in Indonesia, women had the capacity and the ability. What they needed was the level playing field, and the election management body played a really important role in making that happen. So I've been talking for a long time. I'm going to turn my camera back on and turn my video on so that we can see each other. And I'm very happy to have a discussion, and we can go from there. Happy to answer any questions as well.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Regina, for your very insightful presentation this afternoon for us. Ibu-ibu sekalian, atau ada Bapak juga yang mengikuti kegiatan pada sore hari ini, tadi Ms. Regina sudah sampaikan paparan yang menurut saya pribadi memberikan banyak informasi dan cara pandang baru bagi kita. Ya, saya garis bawahi beberapa poin-poin penting tadi. Pertama, tentang bagaimana kita harus pahami inklusivitas itu di dalam pemilu sebagai kondisi di mana perempuan bisa hadir sebagai voters, bisa running di dalam election sendiri, dan bisa serve as a administrator atau bagian dari penyelenggara pemilu ya. Dan Ms. Regina juga sudah mention ada banyak barrier ya, banyak tantangan, bahkan yang cukup mengagetkan bagi saya itu juga sudah mulai dari tataran ambisi ya. Yang kalau kita lihat dari sisi internalnya, ada faktor motivasi dan kepercayaan diri yang berbeda antara perempuan dan laki-laki, yang tentu saja dipengaruhi oleh knowledge-nya, kemudian akses terhadap informasi yang mungkin juga timpang, dan juga ternyata dukungan dari kolega di sekitar yang cukup berbeda. Kepercayaan diri laki-laki bertambah karena kolega di sekitar mereka memberikan dukungan yang lebih positif dibanding kepada perempuan. Tentu saja menghadapi tantangan ini, tadi Ms. Regina mention ada perubahan-perubahan yang harus dilakukan di setiap level ya. Regulasi sampai kepada bagaimana memastikan political will dari para stakeholder sendiri, termasuk tentunya masyarakat di dalamnya. Dan di bagian akhir, ya sebelum tadi Ms. Regina sampaikan beberapa contoh kasus seperti apa yang dikerjakan di Myanmar maupun satu advokasi yang cukup membuahkan hasil yang dilakukan di Meksiko, ada poin penting mengenai bagaimana krusialnya melakukan voter education and outreach ini. Tentu saja di dalam konteks kita Indonesia, baik penyelenggara maupun voters, khususnya perempuan, ini menjadi satu pekerjaan yang lebih berat karena kita dihadapkan pada tantangan yang lebih mungkin sedikit berbeda dibanding negara lain karena ada faktor geografis yang sangat berbeda, dan ditambah dengan masing-masing wilayah itu juga punya faktor kultural yang berbeda, sehingga tidak ada satu strategi yang one size fits all ya. Masing-masing penyelenggara dihadapkan pada tantangan untuk menyesuaikan atau melihat bagaimana konteks di masing-masing wilayah di mana mereka menjabat atau menjadi penyelenggara pemilu. Mari kita manfaatkan sesi diskusi ini ya, kita bisa saling berbagi, kita bisa menceritakan atau menyampaikan apa yang menjadi pertanyaan-pertanyaan di dalam pengalaman masing-masing, kita masih ada cukup banyak waktu. Kita akan buka termin pertama untuk 3 penanya. Bagi yang ingin bertanya bisa gunakan fitur raise hand atau bisa langsung open mic. Dan kami mohon juga untuk sebelum menyampaikan pertanyaan ataupun pernyataan bisa menyebutkan nama dan asal lembaga atau institusinya. Kalau memang tidak memungkinkan untuk menyalakan mic, kami juga mempersilakan jika ada yang mau menyampaikan melalui room chat. Di sini sudah ada satu yang raise hand, Bu Reni Banjar. Sambil menunggu yang lain, saya persilakan Bu Reni Banjar untuk open kamera dan mic kalau memungkinkan, dan silakan sampaikan pertanyaannya dengan singkat.
Oke, terima kasih. The question for Mrs. Regina. Introduce myself. I'm Reni from KPU, Province North Malukas. I want to ask for question. What percentage of women vote for election, and how to educate female votes there? And then about your presentation, how about or what are some barriers to women registering or voter registration? Yes. And I want to explain from you about registration in the person, not registration in the person without officer. In Indonesia, 7 officer to the TPS atau or tempat pemungutan suara. Just it, Mr. Benny, Mas Benny. Just it my question. Thank you.
Ya, terima kasih Bu Reni. Tadi ada beberapa pertanyaan yang mengenai voter education and then about registration ya. Mungkin setelah ini Miss Regina bisa menjawab sekaligus. Kita tunggu dulu 2 penanya lainnya. Silakan Bapak Ibu, jika ada yang ingin bertanya, boleh raise hand, boleh langsung open mic, nyalakan mikrofonnya, ataupun bisa menuliskan pada kolom chat. Ya, kalau tidak ada mungkin saya bisa sampaikan satu pertanyaan mungkin ya. I have a question to Ms. Regina. Sambil menunggu yang lain mungkin sedang mempersiapkan pertanyaan. Tadi Bu Regina sudah paparkan banyak data, tapi saya penasaran tentang persepsi publik terhadap kandidat perempuan. Kalau di dalam konteks Indonesia memang ada kendala kultural yang melihat entah itu dari nilai-nilai tertentu, agama misalnya, yang melihat bahwa perempuan itu tidak bisa menjadi pemimpinnya. Yang kemudian ini menjadi salah satu masalah. Dan di masyarakat pun masih banyak juga tidak hanya berkaitan dengan nilai agama, nilai-nilai kultural tertentu, wilayah-wilayah tertentu juga melihat perempuan sebagai orang yang tidak perlu begitu ya untuk tampil di depan menjadi pejabat publik. Bagaimana dengan pengalaman ataupun pengamatan di negara lain? Apakah let's say Amerika sendiri, apakah bagaimana persepsi publik melihat kandidat perempuan, melihat calon-calon yang running di dalam election ataupun mereka yang kemudian terlibat di dalam penyelenggara pemilu? Walaupun sistem pembentukan penyelenggara pemilu between Indonesia dan Amerika itu berbeda ya, tentu saja berbeda. Mungkin itu pertanyaan saya mengenai persepsi publik. Ada juga yang menanyakan ada 2 pertanyaan ya. Ada satu pertanyaan di kolom chat dari mungkin agak ini sedikit beririsan dengan yang saya tanyakan tadi ya. Di kolom chat Miss Regina bisa baca dan saya akan coba bacakan buat kita ya, dari Athea Sarastiani ya. As a country with a majority Muslim population, some challenges become something that is more limiting to women. Education about the importance of female voters to further increase their intention to exercise their rights is very important. Hopefully in the future, there will be more modules on how to educate the public about the importance of women's roles in voting. Area Sarastiani, Kaukus Perempuan Politik Indonesia. Mungkin ini lebih kepada saran ya, dibanding daripada pertanyaan. Bu penanya tadi menyampaikan mungkin di masa depan bisa ada modul-modul ya mengenai bagaimana meningkatkan ataupun melakukan pendidikan politik bagi perempuan untuk menunjukkan bagaimana pentingnya keterlibatan mereka. Dan mungkin Miss Regina juga jika punya beberapa entah itu hasil-hasil studi ataupun buku dan modul yang bisa juga bermanfaat bagi yang hadir pada hari ini juga bisa dibagikan.
Sure. So
okay.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I understood the question that the first speaker asked.
Okay.
So I know that it was related to voter education and voter registration,
yes.
but I could say a lot of things about both of those. So if somebody has a more precise question there, I'm happy to get to it. I think I'm happy to start by addressing the questions that you posed to me about kind of how to adjust to the fact that in Indonesia in particular, maybe there are these very localized geographies, right? And because it is such a multicultural country, every EMB is addressing specific challenges to the communities that they're in. And of course, a lot of those challenges have religious and kind of deeply rooted cultural aspects, which can sometimes make it feel very difficult to push back against this presumption that women don't need to be out in the public sphere, or women, should not be taking on a political role. So some of those things, I mean, that is there. Those beliefs are kind of felt in literally every society, and there are always going to be religious leaders that will kind of utilize parts of their religious texts or parts of their cultural tradition to kind of push back against women's progress in this space. But there are also plenty of other, leaders from those same faiths that can demonstrate and can show and serve as allies. And there are ways in which to demonstrate that you can be a devout member of your faith and also exercise your kind of basic fundamental rights to be an equal member of your society. And that means, Indonesians have the right to vote, right? They have the right to run for office. They have the right to get an education and to serve as leaders in their communities. And I think if, women are leaders everywhere, whether that's in an official role or not. Women are leading in their households, they're leading in their communities. They're very often managing huge portions of life on a day-to-day basis. And I think a lot of those skills are absolutely transferable to being a leader in a more public way. So I think what we need to do is look for the allies, right? Not just pay attention to those people who say this is not appropriate, this is not something a woman should be doing. There are lots of other voices that we can utilize, and it's very important to look to the local context, because you want to find those credible messengers, those people who know the way to kind of message appropriately on behalf of these basic rights there. So that's what I would say in terms of how do we respond to some of these more cultural and religious arguments. I think fundamentally every person is equal, right, and has the right to exercise their right as a citizen and their ability to participate in public life. So I'm looking at this question now. So what percentage of women vote for the election? How to educate women voters, and what are some barriers to women registering as a voter in person without an official? So that last part, I'm not sure I understand, but there's a lot of the kind of voter education and civic education that happens in countries around the world. Some of it happens in school, right? Sometimes children at high school levels and before they're actually eligible to vote will learn about, the way that the government works, but also, the fact that everybody has the right to vote. And when you vote, you should, you want to educate yourself about what the particular candidate is saying they're going to do when they're in office. And that is how you should be making, that's how you can make a decision. And I do not mean campaigning, right, for a particular candidate. Voter education is very different than that. And civic education is very different than that. And it can start when young people are in school. And if it hasn't happened, then it should absolutely continue afterwards, right? Because there are such gaps to make up about, when, and I guess my point is when we're designing voter education programs, including the types of voter education programs that BWASLU and that EMBs put out there, letting people know how they register to vote, right? Letting people know where they need to go, kind of very mechanical steps about what will happen in the election, like how elections run. There is also, I think, an opportunity that many countries miss, and that most voter education programs and civic education programs miss, to talk about the fact that, that every person has the right and responsibility to take part as voters in elections, right? And that in fact, both men and women should understand that they should be registering to vote and learning about candidates and making their own free decision to do so. I think those are important points that we don't necessarily always make when we're doing voter education campaigns. And we have to be quite careful about, and these are things that can be tailored, I think, to the point earlier about the diversity of Indonesia, just geographically and culturally. The reason I showed that example from Nepal was that it was, sometimes we don't see things that are sending kind of subliminal messages, or messages that are kind of conveying what the status quo is, right? The fact that maybe men are the ones that tend to go out and do this kind of voter registration effort, right? But if we only show printed materials or written materials with pictures of men doing that, people are going to assume that only men can do that, right? And so sometimes we have to be able to put women in these representative roles so that people can see women being effective in these roles. And that is one of the, I think, most important things we can do to push back against those types of stereotypes. And in terms of, I got a question about the United States and how the election management bodies work there, but also just, women's interest and willingness to run for office and the types of critiques that women get when they do run for office. I think these are true in many, many places. I did a talk yesterday about disinformation and gender and disinformation, which is a problem everywhere in the world. It's arguably getting worse as more and more of us rely on the internet and on social media to get our information and to spread information and to share information. We did have, in the United States, we did have women election officials, right, who, because of rhetoric that was out there, were threatened with violence and had to get, have security come to their homes to make sure that people could not come into their homes and harm them. And it happened, it happened to men election officials as well, because the most recent elections were extremely, extremely contentious. And we had some messaging from leaders about the fact that they weren't fair. And so people really felt like they tweeted to attack the election officials that weren't upholding the law, even though I don't think there was any evidence that that was actually the case. But also I would note that the types of threats and comments that women in the public sphere get online and, in the media and, through biased reporting and biased representation is different. It is fundamentally different. It tends to focus on their appearance. It tends to focus on their competence, their morality, whether they should even be out there in the first place. Whereas men are often criticized when they get criticism, and men get plenty of criticism online for the job that they're doing, right? And whether or not, and their policy positions and their actual, their level of efficacy in their job. They don't get that same criticisms. It's just about the fact that you're a woman, you shouldn't be doing this. And then in terms of the types of threats, like when we're getting to the kind of hate speech and threat phase, women are much more likely to be targeted with sexually explicit threats, threats of sexual violence, which are very unsettling, threats against their children, where men are, if they're getting threatened, it is often threats of physical violence. So I think that was, but I guess I would say also in terms of the ambition gap that I mentioned in the United States, but I think is also probably, we see that in other places as well, because of the way that women who do want to put themselves out there, even in a place that doesn't necessarily have some of the same religious based, rationales for why a woman shouldn't be doing some of these things. I can understand why women are not interested in running for office, right? Like, it's expensive. It is, you're putting yourself on the line. You're going to just be inundated with these horrible comments and threats, and being told that you can't do these things. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why that happens in the U.S. in a place that I think is kind of seen as, on the cutting edge of some of these issues, but we have plenty of our own struggles as well. And I'll stop talking and let others weigh in or make comments.
Baik, terima kasih atas responnya, Miss Regina. Masih ada waktu para peserta kuliah umum sore ini. Kita masih akan membuka termin kedua pertanyaan. Jika masih ada yang ingin bertanya, 3 penanya, bisa langsung raise hand ataupun ditulis di kolom chat. Kita bisa manfaatkan ini untuk saling berdiskusi. Ya, ada Delia, kita tunggu dulu sebelum kalau masih ada yang lain. Oke, jika belum ada, sudah ada Delia Wildianti dari Puskapol, sudah raise hand, silakan Mbak Delia.
Oke, terima kasih Mas Beni. Saya izin untuk menanyakan karena memang ada hal-hal yang membuat saya penasaran juga seperti itu. Nah, berbicara soal perempuan gitu ya, running di dalam lembaga penyelenggara pemilu, kami di Puskapol sendiri sebetulnya selain bicara soal argumen kesetaraan dan keadilan gender gitu ya di dalam mendorong dan mengawal kepemimpinan perempuan gitu di lembaga penyelenggara pemilu, kami seringkali gitu ditanyakan soal aspek sosiologis dari urgensi keberadaan perempuan di lembaga penyelenggara pemilu. Nah, saya ingin bertanya gitu ya kepada Ibu Regina, apakah memang sebetulnya di dalam studi-studi komparasi gitu ya yang telah IFES lakukan misalnya di berbagai negara, itu ada temuan gitu atau misalnya ada memang fakta bahwa sebetulnya perempuan itu memang secara sosiologis memiliki keunggulan di dalam kepemimpinannya. Karena itu seringkali gitu ditanyakan kepada kami sendiri memang sekarang dan ke depan akan mencoba untuk mendalami itu dan menjadi satu concern juga untuk menjawabnya secara empiris gitu. Karena selain soal argumen kesetaraan dan keadilan gender, tetapi juga secara aspek sosiologisnya kita juga ingin membuktikan bahwa sebetulnya perempuan juga berkontribusi gitu secara sosiologis di dalam kepemimpinannya. Ada pembeda gitu ya perempuan di dalam kepemimpinannya tersebut, seperti itu. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mbak Delia. Maaf ada banyak pertanyaan dari Puskapol Bu Regina. Sekarang kami kembalikan lagi ya kepada audience, if there are any questions. Tadi Mbak Delia tadi saya ulangi sedikit ingin menanyakan tentang adakah determinan secara sosiologis mungkin ya yang membuat kehadiran perempuan itu bisa menimbulkan dampak yang berbeda di dalam pemilu. Silakan jika masih ada Bapak Ibu yang lain yang ingin bertanya, masih ada waktu atau dituliskan di kolom chat juga boleh. Ada lagi? Baik, jika belum ada, saya berikan waktu untuk Bu Regina dulu untuk merespon pertanyaan dari Mbak Delia.
Okay, so there is definitely evidence in kind of the sociological literature about, and I can't say this is specific to EMBs, but there has been, some studies done about women as leaders, right? And I think this is true. There's been research done in kind of the business sphere, right? Women in corporations, things like that, leadership roles there, and certainly women in elected leadership, so women in parliaments and things like that. And I think the short answer is yes. I think there is evidence, and I'm happy to try to find some of those studies and statistics. It's not evidence that IFES, it's not original research that IFES has conducted, but I can tell you that there is evidence that women tend to be more collaborative in their leadership. They tend to seek consensus, right? And they tend to try to get kind of everybody to an agreed position. They tend to bring more voices into the conversation. So, and that is kind of there have been these studies about women's different leadership styles. So I think that's worth knowing and using, but I'll say a couple of different things because I'm of two minds about it. The other thing that I'll throw out there, right, is that there has been for a long time this discussion about the fact that the countries that have more women in their leadership tend to also have lower levels of corruption, that women, and then that kind of led to this notion that women leaders are less corrupt just by nature, right? That women are somehow more virtuous. And so I don't want us to necessarily fall into that trap, right? There's a couple of things. So I do think that just personally that in observing the way that women tend to relate to each other, I think we are socialized to be more polite, to listen more, to be less confrontational and more collaborative. And that is a bit of a cliche in a lot of ways, but I do think that there is data to bear that out. So I will say that, and I think that we could probably find you some studies to support that. But the other thing that I'll say is that because so many women for so long have been operating as a minority group in these leadership roles, right, and have been trying to get a lot done while being a minority, you could argue also, right, that if women were represented at equal proportions, we wouldn't necessarily be able to be described in a certain way, right? And in fact, maybe if we were at 50-50 parity, you would find women that were just as competitive and just as aggressive with their colleagues. Than otherwise. So I think I worry a little bit about falling into that trap because it also certainly can lend itself to people saying, oh, all women are like this and all men are like this. And so the only way to, you know what I mean? So and I don't think that's true, right? Like women, there are billions of women in the world, there are billions of men in the world. I don't think we would ever say all men do this, right? And so I think we have to be quite careful about saying that all women behave in this way, or that when women are leaders, this is what happens. But I do think we also have evidence that women as political leaders do tend to pay attention to issues that impact not just them, right? So they pay attention to issues about children and about families and about people who are marginalized in their societies, in part because sometimes it's because that's the space that is open for them to fill. And that is the way that their colleagues look to them for expertise, which is potentially problematic in its own way. But I think until we get to more equal representation, that will probably continue to be the default. And I think we want women to feel like they can do anything and be anything, and including as their representative role in, when they're in office. And then for EMBs, though, I think the other argument that you can make is that having a gender sensitive election, right? Having an election that is more responsive to women voters, that does think about the fact that sometimes it's harder for women to get to the polls, that women are less likely to have identification, that it is harder for women to get registered, that women are more likely to be targeted for violence, that women may be pressured by their families to vote in a particular way. If you have more awareness of that across your EMB, you're more likely to be able to make policies that work best for all voters, right? And I think having a broader and more diverse perspective generally and across the board will mean that you're more likely to create policies that are also more gender sensitive and gender responsive. And that's another argument in and of itself for why women should be represented in equal proportion on EMBs and in every public body.
Oke, thank you Miss Regina. Ya, memang benar tantangan terbesar adalah memang mengidentifikasi bagaimana apakah ada kemudian kondisi yang berbeda yang timbul dari kehadiran perempuan di dalam konteks electoral management bodies ya. Kita banyak melihat kerja-kerja perempuan dan perubahan yang dihasilkan di dalam konteks bisnis misalnya seperti Gina tadi mention, kemudian di dalam lingkup mungkin legislatif, di eksekutif ya. Tetapi memang di dalam konteks penyelenggara pemilu kita masih banyak cerita-cerita sukses ya, atau success story dari pengalaman penyelenggara sendiri. Nah, itu sebabnya jika ibu-ibu di sini, bapak-bapak di sini hadir, punya mungkin pengalaman-pengalaman konkret ya, yang dengan kehadiran perempuan di dalam struktur penyelenggara mampu menghadirkan entah itu di dalam bentuk regulasi ataupun strategi-strategi tentu yang membuat pemilu lebih inklusif. Jika ada yang ingin berbagi, pun masih ada yang ingin bertanya, kami masih berikan waktu bagi kita semua. Silakan bisa resen ataupun melalui chat. Silakan Bapak Ibu, jika masih ada yang ingin saya lihat ada banyak alumni SILIDS program Indonesia di sini, kebanyakan dari yang hadir pada hari ini. Jika ada yang ingin menanyakan, ada juga dari akademisi, ada dari penyelenggara, ada dari dari aktivis kepemiluan, ada Mbak Wahidah. Silakan. Apakah ada lagi? Baik, jika tidak ada, kita juga sudah sampai pukul 15:39 waktu Indonesia Barat. Saya rasa ada begitu banyak informasi tadi yang sudah disampaikan Miss Regina. Di bagian akhir tadi saya masih ingat persis bagaimana Miss Regina beberapa pengalaman seperti yang dilakukan di Myanmar ya, Use Your Voice, kemudian advokasi yang dilakukan di Meksiko yang dimulai baru-baru saja dan sudah menunjukkan beberapa perubahan yang signifikan. Kami berharap melalui public lecture yang kita ikuti pada sore hari ini, melalui banyaknya informasi dan pengetahuan yang dibagikan oleh Bu Regina, boleh memberikan satu wawasan baru bagi kita. Terutama, saya ingat di dalam penutupan program SILIDS kita bicara tentang tentang action plan kita, our next action plan, apa yang akan kita kerjakan selanjutnya. Dan mudah-mudahan sore hari ini kita bisa mendapatkan ignite ide, pemantik ide untuk memikirkan hal seperti apa yang kita bisa kerjakan. Mungkin beberapa penyelenggara perempuan hadir di sini sudah punya program-program yang dilaksanakan secara parsial ya, dan juga sudah dibagikan acaranya di dalam grup kita, seperti yang dikerjakan di KPU Riau dan di tempat-tempat lain yang memberdayakan perempuan dengan program-program pendidikan politik. Semoga hal-hal ini kita bisa duplikasi di dalam skala yang lebih luas, terutama di dalam pemilu serentak 2024 mendatang, dan dalam waktu dekat kita akan menyongsong akhir masa jabatan penyelenggara pemilu di tingkat provinsi dan kabupaten kota, dan mari kita juga kawal isu keterwakilan perempuan di level provinsi dan kabupaten kota. Itu saja yang saya bisa sampaikan. Ms. Regina, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. We hope you enjoy your time in Indonesia. We have so many exotic places to visit. We have so many delicious food to taste, and don't miss it. Oke, akhir kata saya sampaikan permintaan jika selama memoderatori diskusi ini ada atau public lecture ini ada kesalahan atau khilafan dari saya kembalikan kepada Mbak Delia sebagai MC. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore, salam sehat untuk kita semua. Yuk, Miss Regina.
Baik, terima kasih Mas Beni dan Miss Regina juga atas kuliah umum yang luar biasa ini. Sebetulnya saya sendiri masih banyak menyimpan pertanyaan gitu, tapi karena MC jadi saya terbatas gitu ya. Jadi mempersilakan ibu-ibu semua sebetulnya untuk bisa bicara langsung gitu ya dengan speaker kita yang sangat expert gitu di bidang ini. Beliau adalah senior gitu ya di IFES begitu. Baik Bapak Ibu semuanya, kita sudah menghabiskan waktu sekitar 2 jam kurang gitu ya. Sudah banyak sekali informasi yang kita dapatkan. Harapannya tadi disampaikan gitu ya oleh Mas Beni juga, harapannya ke depan action plan yang sudah dibuat gitu ya bagi Bapak Ibu yang merupakan alumni She-Leads itu bisa kita laksanakan. Kita juga bisa mengawal isu-isu kepemimpinan perempuan baik itu di lembaga penyelenggara pemilu gitu ya, di legislatif ataupun mendorong peningkatan partisipasi sebagai pemilih seperti itu. Nah, saya yakin di sini Bapak Ibu semua sangat memiliki peran yang sangat signifikan gitu ya untuk mendorong isu kepemimpinan ini di tingkat daerah gitu ya. Kami senantiasa baik dari IFES ataupun dari Puskapol senantiasa terbuka gitu ya untuk selalu berkolaborasi gitu ya, mengawal isu-isu terkait dengan kepemimpinan perempuan dan pemilu inklusif. Terima kasih banyak kami ucapkan kepada Miss Regina, IFES Indonesia, dan pemerintah Australia juga yang telah mendukung gitu ya terlaksananya kuliah umum pada siang sampai sore hari ini. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian yang sudah meluangkan waktunya untuk bersama-sama kita belajar gitu ya, menimba ilmu dan mencari pengalaman komparasi gitu dari negara-negara lain untuk memperkaya pengetahuan kita juga. Terima kasih atas perhatian Bapak Ibu semuanya. Kami selalu berharap Bapak Ibu senantiasa dalam keadaan sehat. Saya izin untuk menutup sesi pada siang sampai sore hari ini. Kami dari Puskapol mengucapkan mohon maaf apabila di dalam pelaksanaan kuliah umum ini ada kesalahan ataupun ada kekurangan, mohon untuk dimaafkan. Baik, terima kasih. Sampai jumpa di pertemuan selanjutnya. Saya ucapkan terima kasih banyak. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bapak Ibu, Bu Regina sudah mencantumkan email. Apabila di kolom chat sudah ada email Bu Regina, kalau pertanyaan lanjutan ataupun